I am Naomi, 32 years old, and a senior geologist. When my parents passed away, they left my older brother Marcus a stunning $1.2 million mansion in Miami. For me, they left a broken, rotting cabin sitting on a frozen wasteland in the absolute middle of nowhere in Alaska. The very same day the will was read, my fiancé Jamal looked me dead in the eyes, called me a pathetic loser who would never amount to anything, and walked right out the door, leaving me completely alone. In my absolute despair, and with nowhere else to turn, I bought a one-way ticket to that freezing Alaskan cabin just to see the joke of an inheritance my parents thought I deserved. But when I started digging into that frozen dirt, I found something hiding beneath the ice. Something that would end up being worth over $100 million. Before I reveal exactly how I turned my family's cruelest insult into an empire that crushed them all, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family who prayed for your downfall. To understand how sweet my ultimate payback truly was, you have to understand the suffocating dynamic of the Williams family. We were an affluent African American family where social status and outward appearances were not just important, they were everything. My parents, Richard and Vivian, built their wealth from the ground up, and they absolutely worshipped corporate success. But in their eyes, success only looked one way, and it looked exactly like my brother Marcus. He was the ultimate golden child, a perfectly groomed venture capital director who cared only about power. He married a white woman named Chloe, who cared far more about maintaining her elite social standing and collecting designer handbags than showing basic human decency. I, on the other hand, was the designated disappointment because I chose science and environmental assessment over high finance. My parents saw my career as a geologist as playing in the mud, a gritty hobby completely beneath the pristine Williams family name. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, and every Sunday family dinner was a masterclass in microaggressions designed to make me feel small, while Marcus was paraded around like royalty. I spent my entire life biting my tongue and shrinking my own presence just to keep the peace in that house. I accepted their subtle jabs and obvious favoritism because I foolishly believed that deep down we were still family. But the morning we were summoned to read my parents' final will was the day my silence permanently ended. Sitting in that freezing waiting room, I had no idea my parents had planned one final, ultimate humiliation from beyond the grave. The heavy wooden gavel struck the polished mahogany desk with a sharp, deafening crack that echoed through the room, signaling the start of the reading and marking the exact moment my entire world was ripped apart. Mr. Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and picked up the thick stack of papers bound in navy blue leather. The air conditioning in the high-rise Seattle office hummed quietly, but I could hear my own heartbeat thumping against my ribs. Jamal sat close to me, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. He leaned in and whispered that we were finally going to get the capital he needed for his startup company. I kept my eyes locked on the attorney, refusing to let Jamal distract me. Across the heavy mahogany table sat my brother Marcus, wearing a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit, looking utterly relaxed. His wife Chloe sat beside him, meticulously checking her perfect manicure, looking completely bored by the entire proceeding. To my eldest son, Marcus Williams, I leave the primary residence located in Miami, Florida. Mr. Sterling read, his voice monotone and practiced. This includes the $1.2 million estate on Star Island and all its contents. Along with the property, I leave the entirety of the Williams family investment portfolio, including all shares in the technology and pharmaceutical sectors. Furthermore, Marcus will receive full and immediate control of the liquid asset accounts, totaling just over $3.5 million. I watched Marcus lean back in his oversized leather chair. He did not look surprised or humbled by this massive fortune. He looked completely entitled to it. He casually adjusted the cuffs of his suit while Chloe let out a soft, delighted gasp. She immediately pulled out her phone, her eyes wide with greed, probably already calculating the renovations she would make to the Miami estate, and plotting which of my parents' antique furnishings she would throw away. Jamal squeezed my hand so tightly, it actually hurt his breathing, growing heavy with anticipation. He thought my share was coming next. He thought we were about to become millionaires too. And now for my daughter Naomi Williams. Mr. Sterling paused. He actually hesitated, looking over the top of his glasses at me with an expression that looked sickeningly like pity. He cleared his throat loudly and looked back down at the legal document. To Naomi, I leave the deed to the parcel of undeveloped land located in the Yukon-Koyukuk census area in rural Alaska. This includes the unmaintained 50-year-old timber cabin currently residing on the property. No liquid assets, trust funds, or investment portfolios are attached to this portion of the estate. That was it. That was the entirety of my inheritance. A broken-down, rotting shack on a piece of frozen barren earth in the absolute middle of nowhere, while my brother inherited an empire of cash and luxury real estate. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. Then I felt it. The sudden sharp movement beside me. Jamal, who had been holding my hand with a vice grip just moments ago, physically withdrew. He pulled his hand away as if my skin had suddenly caught fire and shifted his chair several inches away from me. I did not need to look at him to know the disgust forming on his face. The man who had promised to marry me had just realized his meal ticket was entirely worthless. I did not burst into tears. I did not scream or throw a tantrum. My entire career as a geologist was built on analyzing immense pressure fault lines and structural integrity. I am a scientist. I deal in cold, hard facts. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and looked directly at the attorney. Mr. Sterling, I need to see the itemized asset declaration sheet. I want to see the exact financial breakdown of the estate distribution and the original purchase documents for the Alaskan property. Before Mr. Sterling could even slide the document across the polished desk, Marcus lunged forward. His hand slammed down on the paperwork with a loud smack, and he snatched the entire folder right out of the attorney's hands. You do not need to look at any financial breakdowns, Naomi. Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. He stood up, looming over the table to use his physical size to intimidate me. You would not even understand what you are looking at. These are complex investment portfolios and high-level real estate deeds, not a collection of shiny rocks. Give me the paperwork, Marcus, I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and maintaining direct eye contact. It is a legal document concerning my inheritance, and I have every right to review it. Marcus held the folder out of my reach, looking down at me with the exact same look of profound disappointment our parents used to give me every single time I walked into a room. Why do you need to see the numbers? He laughed harshly, a cruel sound that echoed in the quiet office. Mom and Dad finally gave you exactly what you have always wanted. You spent your entire life obsessed with dirt and mud. You rejected the prestigious business school applications they paid for. You refused to join the corporate world. You embarrassed them by choosing a career where you wear hiking boots and dig in the dirt instead of wearing designer heels in a corporate boardroom. Chloe chimed in with a soft, mocking laugh. She leaned against Marcus, wrapping her pale arm around his expensive suit jacket. Honestly, Naomi, you should be extremely grateful. Marcus and I are going to have to deal with the massive property taxes, the legal fees, and the immense stress of managing a multi-million-dollar estate. You get a nice, quiet place to go camping. You can study all the ice and rocks you want up there in the freezing cold. It perfectly suits your rugged lifestyle. Your parents knew you could never handle the pressure of real wealth. I kept my gaze fixed on Marcus, refusing to let their tag team bullying break my composure. Our parents bought that Alaskan property 20 years ago for practically nothing. I said, my voice steady and sharp. It has zero infrastructure. It is completely isolated and freezing for 9 months out of the year. You are standing there inheriting millions of dollars in liquid cash and a luxury mansion while justifying leaving your own sister with a piece of uninhabitable wasteland. Marcus slammed the folder back down on the desk, but kept his hand firmly planted on top of it. Because you do not deserve a single dime of the real money, Naomi. He raised his voice, the mask of the polished executive slipping completely to reveal the arrogant tyrant underneath. Do you have any idea how hard Mom and Dad worked to secure their place in elite society? They fought tooth and nail to sit in the executive boardrooms that you completely turned your back on. They built a legacy of black excellence, and you decided to be a glorified dirt digger. I honored their sacrifices. I doubled their investments. You brought nothing to this family but constant embarrassment. A master degree in geology. What an absolute joke. Mom used to cry with shame when her friends at the country club asked what her daughter did for a living. They knew if they gave you a single dollar of the real money, you would just waste it on some pathetic environmental research project. You are a terrible investment. Naomi and Mom and Dad never funded bad investments. Jamal stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Marcus, with an apologetic, pathetic expression. Listen, Marcus, I had no idea about any of this. Jamal said, his voice practically shaking with cowardice. She told me she was an equal partner in this family. I thought she was getting an equal share of the cash. My own fiancé was apologizing to my brother for my lack of wealth. The betrayal burned a hole straight through my chest, but I forced myself to remain completely stoic. I was surrounded by vultures waiting to pick my bones clean, but I refused to let them see me bleed. Marcus let out a low chuckle, looking Jamal up and down with absolute contempt. At least your boyfriend has enough business sense to recognize a sinking ship when he sees one, Marcus said, straightening his custom silk tie. He understands how the real world operates. You see, Naomi, Mom and Dad did not build a generational empire just to hand it over to someone who cannot even balance a basic investment portfolio. I stood my ground, refusing to look at Jamal, who was now nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot. My career requires analyzing data that dictates the survival of multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects. I replied, keeping my tone deadly even. I do not play in the mud. I assess environmental risks that your little venture capital firms rely on before they even break ground. But Mom and Dad were always too obsessed with country club optics to understand actual scientific value. Marcus slammed his hand on the desk again, the sound cracking like a whip. Optics are everything, he shouted, his voice echoing off the floor to ceiling glass walls of the office. Do you have any idea what it took for a black family to break into the circles Mom and Dad conquered? The blood, the sweat, the absolute sacrifices they made to sit at those elite tables. They had to be 10 times better, 10 times smarter, and 10 times richer just to get a seat in the room. They built a legacy of undeniable black excellence. And what did you do? You showed up to formal family dinners with dirt under your fingernails, talking about tectonic plates and soil erosion. You actively rejected every high society networking opportunity they handed you on a silver platter. He began pacing the length of the attorney office, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Mom tried to groom you. She bought you the right designer clothes. She introduced you to the sons of influential politicians and corporate executives. But you insisted on wearing those ridiculous hiking boots and dating a guy struggling to launch a tech app. You told her wealthy friends that corporate finance was morally bankrupt. You embarrassed our parents at every single turn. They realized very early on that you possessed absolutely zero economic mindset. You were a walking liability to the Williams name. Chloe nodded emphatically, crossing her arms over her chest to draw attention to her massive diamond engagement ring. Marcus works 80-hour weeks to maintain this family standing. She chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and profound condescension. He sits in high-pressure boardrooms making decisions that affect thousands of jobs. He knows how to multiply wealth and leverage assets. You do not even know how to dress for a basic charity gala without causing a scene. Leaving you the Miami mansion would have been financially negligent. You would have turned it into a homeless shelter for stray animals or a commune for your environmentalist friends. I looked directly at Chloe, a woman who had never worked a single day in her life since marrying my brother, lecturing me about hard work and legacy. You married into this family for a black card and a prestigious zip code, Chloe, I said sharply, my voice cutting through her pretentious attitude. Do not lecture me about the Williams family legacy when the only thing you contribute to it is maximizing the credit limit at luxury boutiques. Chloe's face turned a violent shade of red. She opened her mouth to scream, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing her immediately. He walked slowly back to the mahogany table and leaned in close to my face. The scent of his expensive cologne was overpowering, thick, and sickeningly sweet. You are exactly the bitter, resentful loser Mom always said you were. Marcus whispered, his eyes narrowed into dark, hostile slits. You cannot handle the fact that they saw right through your rebellious, independent act. They knew you were just too weak to cut it in our world. That Alaskan property is the perfect inheritance for you. It is isolated, it is frozen, and it is completely worthless. Just like your position in this family. I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I held his gaze with a cold, piercing intensity that I knew unnerved him. I want copies of every single document in that file, Marcus. I demanded, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. I am going to have my own legal counsel review the estate breakdown. Mom and Dad may have favored you, but they were meticulous about legal procedures and asset distribution. I want to see the exact wording of the trust documents and the comprehensive purchase history of that Alaskan land. If there is a single cent missing or a single loophole you exploited to grab more cash, I will drag you through probate court for the next 10 years. I will make your life a living nightmare. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Mr. Sterling, who had been sitting frozen in his chair trying to blend into the background, suddenly looked extremely uncomfortable. He glanced nervously at Marcus, gripping his expensive fountain pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. Marcus stopped pacing. The smug, arrogant smile melted off his face, replaced by a look of genuine, calculated malice. He planted both hands on the table and leaned so close I could feel the heat radiating off his anger. You are not hiring a lawyer. Marcus stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register that promised absolute destruction. You are not contesting this will. You are going to sign the acceptance paperwork right here today, take the deed to that frozen pile of garbage, and walk out of this office. Or what? I challenged him, refusing to back down an inch. You already took everything else. Marcus smiled again, but this time it was a cold, predatory grin that made my stomach turn. Or I will financially ruin the one thing you actually still care about, he said smoothly, relishing the power he held. You see, Naomi, before Dad passed away, he set up a small separate wedding fund for you. A little pity account to help pay for your big day with Jamal here, since he clearly cannot afford to give you a proper wedding. It has exactly $50,000 in it. But Dad put me in charge of dispersing those funds. I am the sole executor of that specific account. He paused, letting the heavy weight of his words sink in. He slowly shifted his gaze to Jamal, who immediately perked up, his eyes widening at the explicit mention of $50,000. If you even think about calling a lawyer? Marcus continued, his eyes locking back onto mine with ruthless intent. If you even attempt to delay this probate process by a single day, I will freeze that wedding fund permanently. I will tie it up in so much bureaucratic red tape and legal disputes that you will be old and gray before you see a single dime of it. You will have to get married in a dirty courthouse wearing a cheap dress, while Jamal wonders why he ever settled for the poor, disinherited sister. Sign the papers, Naomi. Take your dirt and go. Or I promise you I will make sure you leave here with absolutely nothing. Chloe sighed softly, uncrossing her long legs and placing her pristine white leather Hermes Birkin bag precisely on the center of the mahogany desk. She traced the gleaming gold hardware with her perfectly manicured finger, performing a deliberate display of the extreme wealth she had effortlessly married into. Marcus, darling. There is no need to raise your voice and get yourself so worked up, Chloe murmured, looking at her husband with artificial fondness before turning her cold blue eyes directly on me. Her gaze held that specific brand of weaponized pity that only women of her social standing could execute so flawlessly. Naomi, you are becoming terribly hostile, and it is frankly not a good look for you. Stress causes premature aging, and you already refuse to invest in a proper skincare routine or visit my dermatologist. You are making this room incredibly negative. She leaned forward, resting her delicate chin on her hand, playing the role of the benevolent savior, while slipping her verbal knives between my ribs. You really need to look at this situation from a place of gratitude rather than bitter resentment, sweetie. Your parents knew exactly how much you struggle with the basic pressures of high society. You always look so painfully uncomfortable at our charity galas standing in the corner in those cheap off-the-rack dresses. They actually gave you a profound gift today. You should view this Alaskan property as a spiritual retreat. Think of it as a permanent camping trip to cleanse your impoverished soul. I stared at her, letting her words hang in the heavy air of the law office. The sheer audacity of this woman lecturing me about hard work and spiritual cleansing while dripping in diamonds bought with my family money was staggering. She had spent the last 5 years using her proximity to my brother wealth to punch down at me at every opportunity. You can go up there, commune with nature, dig in the freezing dirt, and find your inner peace away from the complicated financial world you despise so much. Chloe continued, her voice sickly sweet. And really, Naomi, fighting your own brother over $50,000 is just incredibly petty. It is literal pocket change for Marcus, but clearly a massive fortune for you and Jamal. Why drag this out through the courts and embarrass yourself further? Just sign the papers. You can take your little camper van up north and leave the adult responsibilities to the people equipped to handle them. We are actually doing you a massive favor by taking the heavy burden of real wealth and legacy off your fragile shoulders. I had heard enough. I refused to engage with Chloe and her performative charity. I needed to shut this entire circus down. I turned my head to look at Jamal, fully expecting my fiancé to stand up, push his chair back, and defend our future. I expected the man who had promised to protect me to tell Marcus to go to hell and reject their toxic money right to their faces. We had built a life together. We had plans to buy a home, to start a family. I desperately needed a united front. But when I looked at Jamal, the words of protest died instantly in my throat. He was not looking at me with solidarity. He was not glaring at Marcus with righteous anger. Jamal was staring directly at the legal folder under Marcus' hand. His eyes were wide, his breathing shallow, and his posture had completely shifted. The man I loved was looking at my arrogant brother with an expression of pure, unadulterated reverence. It was the look of a starving man staring through a window at a banquet. Jamal swallowed hard. He slowly pulled his hands off the table and wiped his sweaty palms on his cheap dress slacks. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of the indignation I expected. Instead, it was smooth, accommodating, and sickeningly polite. Marcus. Jamal began, pitching his voice to sound entirely reasonable and submissive. I think emotions are just running a bit high right now. Naomi is just surprised by the reading. That is all. There is absolutely no need for any legal disputes or lawyers. We completely respect your parents' final wishes and their incredible legacy. I felt the air violently leave my lungs. I stared at the side of his face, unable to comprehend what was unfolding in front of me. Jamal. I whispered, my voice tight with shock. What are you doing? Jamal ignored me completely. He kept his eyes locked on Marcus, submitting to my brother authority without a single ounce of shame or hesitation. You make a very fair point, Marcus. Probate court would just be a massive waste of time and resources for everyone involved here. Naomi and I do not want to cause any trouble for the Williams family. We just want to move forward peacefully. And regarding the wedding fund, Jamal paused, licking his lips nervously, his greed entirely overriding his loyalty. We would be extremely grateful for your guidance on that. $50,000 would be instrumental in helping me scale my tech startup. I know you have an incredible eye for business investments, and I would actually love to pick your brain about my app over a round of golf sometime. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. He was selling me out. In the span of 5 short minutes, my fiancé had evaluated the power dynamic in the room and decided that throwing me under the bus was the quickest way to get his hands on that $50,000 check. His tech startup had been failing for months, draining our shared savings and making him desperate. Now he was practically begging Marcus for a handout, willing to trade my dignity and my legal rights for a fraction of the wealth my brother had just inherited. Chloe let out a high-pitched, delighted laugh, clapping her hands together softly. See, Naomi, even Jamal understands how the real world works. He is being perfectly sensible and mature. You really should take notes from your partner's sweetie. He clearly recognizes the immense value of staying on Marcus' good side. Marcus smiled a broad, victorious grin that showcased his perfect veneers. He leaned back in his executive chair, removing his hand from the folder and gesturing magnanimously toward Jamal. You know, Jamal, I always thought you were aiming a bit low by settling for my sister, but maybe you do have some potential after all. If you can get her to sign these documents today, without any more of her typical dramatic outbursts, I will personally make sure the wedding fund is released to your account by Friday afternoon. I might even introduce your little software app to some of my junior investors. Consider it an early wedding gift from the Williams estate. Jamal's face lit up with absolute unhidden joy. Thank you, Marcus. Seriously, man, I appreciate that more than you know. I will make sure the paperwork is handled right now. Jamal finally turned to look at me. His eyes did not hold a single ounce of apology or guilt. They were hard, calculating, and entirely focused on his own financial survival. He reached across the desk, grabbed the heavy brass pen from the attorney tray, and forcefully pushed the final acceptance documents directly in front of me. Sign it, Naomi. Jamal ordered, his tone entirely different from the loving partner I thought I knew. It was a harsh, demanding command. Do not ruin this for us because of your stupid pride. You are not going to win a legal battle against Marcus, and you know it. He has millions and we have nothing. Just take the Alaskan property and let it go so we can move on. We need that $50,000. I need that $50,000 to keep my company afloat. Stop being so stubborn and just sign the paper. I looked from Jamal to Marcus, then to Chloe, who was smiling triumphantly, and finally down at the brass pen resting on the legal document. The betrayal was absolute and total. The family that had despised me their entire lives had successfully weaponized their inherited wealth to buy the loyalty of the man I loved. And the worst part was realizing exactly how cheap his loyalty turned out to be. They had effectively stripped away every single layer of support I had in the world, leaving me completely isolated in a room full of people who viewed my existence as nothing more than a minor inconvenience to be managed and dismissed. I signed the documents with a hand so steady it surprised even me. I did not shed a single tear as I pushed the heavy leather folder back across the mahogany desk. I walked out of that high-rise office with the deed to a frozen wasteland and the sudden crushing realization that the last 5 years of my life had been a complete lie. That evening, Jamal insisted we go to an upscale steakhouse in downtown Seattle. He claimed it was to decompress after a stressful day, but the frantic, greedy energy radiating off him told an entirely different story. He was practically vibrating with excitement over the $50,000 Marcus had promised to release to him. We were seated in a dimly lit corner booth. The restaurant buzzed with the low hum of wealthy patrons, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the scent of expensive roasted meats. Jamal ordered a $200 bottle of Cabernet without even looking at the price. As soon as the waiter walked away, the artificial supportive smile completely dropped from his face. He leaned across the table, invading my personal space with a cold, aggressive posture. So how exactly are you planning to cover your half of the mortgage on the downtown condo next month? Jamal asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, interrogating whisper. I stared at him in utter disbelief. The wine had not even arrived yet, and he was already cornering me about bills. I just lost my entire family and my inheritance, Jamal, I said, keeping my voice low but firm. Is the rent really the first thing you want to discuss right now? He scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. Do not play the victim here, Naomi. You did this to yourself. You knew exactly how much your parents valued corporate success, and you deliberately defied them at every single turn with your environmental crusades. If you had just played the game and swallowed your stupid pride, you would have walked out of that office with millions today. Instead, you let Marcus take everything. Why did you not fight harder for a cash settlement? Why did you not negotiate with him before we got into that room and let him blindside us? I fought for my dignity. I replied, my chest tightening with a deep, burning anger. And you sold me out for a $50,000 check. You groveled to the man who just robbed me. I secured capital for our future. Jamal hissed, leaning closer, his eyes wide with a frantic, manic energy. My startup is bleeding money, Naomi. That wedding fund is the only thing keeping my company out of bankruptcy right now. And let us be completely clear about this moving forward. I am using every single cent of that $50,000 to scale my application. I am not wasting Marcus money on a white dress or catering when my business desperately needs a cash injection. You are going to have to figure out how to pay your share of the living expenses, because I am cutting back on my contributions starting today. I sat back against the leather booth, completely paralyzed by his absolute audacity. He was not just stealing the one small token my father had left for my wedding. He was demanding that I finance our daily lives while he gambled away my money on his failing tech venture. You are pathetic, Jamal. I said, the realization hitting me with sharp crystal clarity. You do not love me. You were just waiting for the Williams family wealth to drop into your lap. You stayed with me because you thought I was a trust fund baby waiting for a massive payout. And the second you realized I was cut out, you attached yourself to the nearest person with a checkbook. Jamal's jaw clenched tightly. He pointed a finger at me, his eyes cold and calculating, dropping the supportive boyfriend act entirely. Do not talk to me about being pathetic, Naomi. You are a 32-year-old woman with a worthless geology degree and a piece of frozen dirt in Alaska. I am trying to build a tech empire. I needed a partner who could bring actual capital and connections to the table. You failed to do that. You alienated the most powerful people in your life because you wanted to play in the mud. I wasted 5 years waiting for a payout that you threw away because you refused to wear a nice dress and smile at your parents' country club friends. Before I could respond to his vicious insult, a loud, familiar laugh cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. I froze. The sound sent a fresh wave of ice straight down my spine. Well, look who it is. Marcus' voice boomed, projecting clearly over the surrounding tables. I turned my head slowly. Marcus and Chloe were strolling through the dining room, led by the restaurant manager toward the exclusive VIP section in the back. Marcus held a bottle of vintage champagne by the neck, swinging it casually. Chloe was draped in a silk evening gown, her diamond necklace catching the dim restaurant lighting and flashing brilliantly. They had clearly come here to celebrate their massive windfall and the successful theft of my inheritance. Chloe stopped right next to our booth, putting her hand on her hip and looking down her nose at me. The malicious glee in her eyes was unmistakable. Naomi, darling, what an absolute surprise to see you here. I would have thought you would be at a camping supply store stocking up on thermal underwear for your big move. Several diners at nearby tables turned their heads to watch the commotion. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the Seattle elite to establish her dominance. Marcus chuckled, taking a sip directly from his champagne glass. Have you two started planning the ceremony yet? He asked, his voice dripping with heavy faux concern. Because I was just telling Chloe about your impressive new real estate portfolio. Chloe let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her chest. Oh, that is right. The beautiful Alaskan estate. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the back of Jamal's chair and raising her voice so the neighboring tables could hear every single word. Tell me, Naomi, for your grand wedding in that freezing little dirt hut, do you need us to send an old heater? We have a rusty space heater in the Miami mansion garage that we were going to throw in the trash tomorrow morning. I would be more than happy to ship it up north for your honeymoon, as a charitable donation to the less fortunate. Laughter erupted from Marcus, loud and grating. A few people at the adjacent tables snickered behind their leather-bound menus. I felt the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck, burning my cheeks, but I locked my jaw and refused to look away. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break in public. I turned to Jamal, fully expecting him to finally stand up and defend me. I expected him to tell my brother to back off to defend the woman he supposedly loved against this blatant public disrespect. Instead, Jamal let out a nervous, accommodating chuckle. He actually smiled at Marcus, completely ignoring the horrific insult Chloe had just hurled at me. "Actually, Marcus," Jamal said, standing up from the booth and eagerly extending his hand to my brother. "I was hoping to get on your calendar next week. I would love to show you the beta version of the software. I think your venture capital firm would be extremely interested in the user acquisition data we just pulled." Marcus looked at Jamal's outstretched hand and then let out a derisive, dismissive snort. He did not shake it. "We will see, Jamal," Marcus said, looking at my fiancé like he was a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of his expensive shoe. "Make sure my sister does not freeze to death before you get that wedding fund." With a final mocking smirk, Marcus and Chloe walked away, heading toward their private dining room to celebrate the millions they had just stolen from me. Jamal slowly sat back down, his face flushed with deep embarrassment from Marcus' public rejection. But he did not look at me with regret or apology. He looked at me with deep, simmering resentment, as if my very existence was the reason Marcus had refused to shake his hand. The heavy silence at our table was broken only by the sound of Jamal breathing heavily through his nose. His jaw worked back and forth as he stared at the spot where Marcus had just been standing. When he finally shifted his gaze back to me, his eyes were completely devoid of any affection we once shared. There was only cold, hard calculation. "You humiliated me," Jamal hissed, his voice trembling with misdirected rage. "You sat there and provoked them when you knew I needed that connection. You deliberately sabotaged my chance to pitch my software to Marcus just to satisfy your own bitter ego." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of his delusion. "I sabotaged you," I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "My brother just publicly degraded me. His wife told me to go freeze to death in a dirt hut. And your first instinct was to beg the man who stole my inheritance for a business meeting. You humiliated yourself, Jamal." He slammed his hand against the table, rattling the silverware. "Because I am trying to build a future," he snapped, leaning forward aggressively. "I am trying to build an empire, and you are nothing but an anchor dragging me straight to the bottom. I needed a partner with capital Naomi. I needed someone whose family could open doors for me in this city. You told me you were a Williams. You let me believe you had equal standing in that family. You let me believe there was a massive safety net waiting for us. I never lied to you about who I am." I countered, my chest tight with a mixture of grief and absolute disgust. "I told you I built my own career. You just only heard the parts with dollar signs attached. You saw a black woman from a wealthy family, and you saw a human ATM." Jamal let out a cruel, humorless laugh. "And look how that turned out," he spat, shaking his head in profound disappointment. "You have absolutely nothing. You are 32 years old, and your own parents decided you were too incompetent to handle real money. You are a joke to them, and now you are a joke to the entire Seattle venture capital community. Marcus is right about you. You are a terrible investment. I cannot believe I wasted 5 years of my life waiting for a payday from a woman who prefers rocks over real estate." He abruptly reached for his left wrist. With sharp, jerky movements, he unclasps the silver Tag Heuer watch I had bought for his 30th birthday. I had saved for 6 months to buy him that watch, working overtime on environmental assessments, just to give him something that made him feel successful during his early startup days. He ripped it off his wrist and slammed it down onto the center of the wooden table. The heavy metal cracked loudly against the polished surface, echoing the final fracture of our relationship. "I am done," Jamal declared, his tone dripping with absolute finality. "I am not spending another second of my life pretending to support your rugged, independent lifestyle when the reality is that you are just a pathetic loser who got cut out of her own family fortune. I need a woman who elevates my status, not a woman who gets laughed at by the people I am desperately trying to do business with. The wedding is completely off. The relationship is over." He stood up and snatched his expensive wool coat from the booth. He did not look back at the watch or the 5 years of history we had just destroyed. He looked right past me, his eyes fixed entirely on the frosted glass doors of the VIP dining room, where my brother and sister-in-law were currently ordering caviar and celebrating my downfall. "You need to figure out your own way home," Jamal said callously, tossing a $50 bill onto the table to cover his untouched glass of wine. I have to go fix the massive networking disaster you just caused. If I play this right, Marcus might still respect me for cutting ties with the family disappointment. I need to make sure he knows I am entirely on his side now. I sat frozen in the leather booth watching the man I was supposed to marry adjust his collar, smooth his hair, and literally sprint across the dining room floor. He practically jogged toward the VIP section, desperate to grovel at the feet of the brother who had just stolen my entire livelihood. He abandoned me in the middle of a crowded restaurant without a single second thought, throwing away 5 years of loyalty for the slim chance of getting a $50,000 handout from my abusers. The waiter approached my table a moment later holding a fresh bottle of wine and looking awkwardly at the empty seat across from me. I did not cry. The betrayal was so absolute and so profound that it completely bypassed sorrow and immediately ignited something much colder and much more dangerous inside me. I picked up the silver watch Jamal had left behind, feeling the heavy weight of the metal in my palm. My family had stripped me of my wealth, and my fiancé had stripped me of my future. They all believed I was thoroughly defeated. They all thought they had left me with a worthless pile of dirt in the frozen north. They had absolutely no idea that their greed had just pushed me exactly where I needed to go. I slid the heavy silver watch into my purse and dropped a $100 bill onto the table to cover my untouched wine. I stood up, smoothed the fabric of my skirt, and walked out of the steakhouse into the biting chill of the Seattle night. I did not look back toward the VIP room. I did not waste a single tear on a man whose loyalty could be bought for $50,000. When I unlocked the door to the downtown condo, Jamal and I shared the space already felt completely dead to me. His shoes were by the door. His jacket was draped over the chair. I ignored all of it. I walked straight past the master bedroom and went directly into my home office. I pulled my heavy-duty Pelican transport cases out from the storage closet. I bypassed the designer clothes my mother had always pressured me to wear. Instead, I packed my extreme weather gear: thermal layers, insulated waterproof boots, and heavy parkas. Then I moved to my professional equipment. I carefully secured my ground-penetrating radar scanner, my deep soil sampling kits, my portable mass spectrometer, and my thermal imaging drones. This was the equipment my parents had always mocked, the tools of my supposedly pathetic dirt-digging trade. I packed every single piece with meticulous precision. My plan was incredibly simple and entirely ruthless. I was going to fly to Alaska in the dead of winter, evaluate the topography of that worthless land, and list it on the commercial market for whatever cash I could get. $10,000 or $50,000, it did not matter to me. I just needed to liquidate that property to legally and financially sever the absolute last string tying me to the Williams family name. I would use whatever cash I got to break the lease on this condo, kick Jamal out onto the street, and completely erase my past. By 6:00 the next morning, I was at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, boarding a commercial flight to Fairbanks. The winter storms in the north were already brutal, making travel highly dangerous. But I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, driving momentum. Once I landed in Fairbanks, I paid an exorbitant fee to charter a twin-engine bush plane. It was the only way to reach the isolated coordinates listed on the deed Mr. Sterling had given me. The small aircraft rattled violently as we ascended into the gray winter sky. The cabin was freezing and smelled strongly of aviation fuel and old leather. Below us, the landscape quickly transformed from civilization into a massive, terrifying expanse of jagged mountains and endless, blinding white snow. The pilot shouted over the deafening roar of the propellers, warning me about the severe weather systems moving in. I just nodded, ignoring the turbulence that made the small plane drop terrifyingly through the freezing air. I leaned my head against the scratched plastic window of the aircraft. The freezing temperature of the glass seeped directly into my skin, but I welcomed the bite. I stared down at the unforgiving frozen wilderness stretching out for hundreds of miles in every direction. My reflection stared back at me in the window. The woman looking back was completely unrecognizable from the one who had walked into that law office 24 hours ago. There was no grief in my eyes, There was no heartbreak over Jamal and no sorrow over my parents' final insult. My eyes were entirely cold hard and unblinking. Marcus and Chloe thought they had exiled me to a frozen graveyard. They thought the harsh Alaskan winter would break whatever spirit I had left. But they fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I am a geologist. I have spent my entire life studying how immense crushing pressure transforms basic carbon into diamonds. They thought they had buried me under the ice. They were about to find out exactly what happens when you apply too much pressure to the wrong kind of stone. The landing gear of the bush plane slammed violently against the frozen surface of a nameless lake, shaking my teeth in my skull. We skidded across the ice for several hundred yards before grinding to a halt in the middle of an absolute whiteout. The pilot did not kill the engines. He jumped out into the biting wind, helping me unload my heavy Pelican cases onto the frozen ground as fast as humanly possible. He shouted over the roar of the propellers, telling me he would monitor the radio channel we agreed upon and return in exactly 3 days unless the storm systems worsened. I gave him a curt nod and watched the small aircraft accelerate down the ice, pulling up into the gray sky and vanishing into the snowstorm. I was completely alone. The silence that followed the departing plane was heavy and absolute, broken only by the aggressive howl of the Arctic wind. The temperature was easily 20 degrees below zero, but my insulated gear held the cold at bay. I strapped my transport cases to a heavy-duty utility sled, powered up my handheld GPS, and began the grueling trek toward the exact coordinates listed on the deed. The hike took 2 hours of pushing through dense pine forests and knee-deep snowdrifts. When I finally crested a small ridge and laid eyes on my inheritance, I actually let out a dry, hollow laugh. Marcus had not been exaggerating about the state of the property. The cabin was not a rustic retreat. It was a structural corpse. The roof had caved in on the left side, crushed by decades of heavy snow accumulation. The timber walls were blackened with rot and leaning at a precarious angle. The front door was barely hanging on by a single rusted hinge. It was a miserable, collapsing pile of garbage sitting on a vast expanse of frozen nothingness. I dragged my sled up to the porch, kicked the broken door aside, and stepped into the dim interior. The inside offered minimal protection from the wind, but it was entirely stripped bare. There was no electricity, no running water, and no insulation. I set up my heavy-duty camping lantern, fired up a portable propane heater, and quickly established a base of operations in the dry corner of the room. My initial plan remained unchanged. I would spend the afternoon walking the perimeter, mapping the exact boundary lines with my GPS, taking some basic surface photos and preparing the real estate listing. I just needed to verify the acreage so I could dump this worthless asset on the commercial market by Monday morning. I strapped on my snowshoes, grabbed my mapping equipment, and stepped back out into the freezing storm. I started at the southern boundary line, tracing the invisible perimeter demarcated by the GPS coordinates. The land was heavily wooded and aggressively hostile, but as I pushed toward the northern edge of the property, my professional training began to override my personal anger. My eyes, trained to spot geological anomalies and unnatural terrain shifts, caught something completely out of place. Running along the northern boundary was an old, dilapidated barbed wire fence. Most of it was buried under the snow or rusted entirely through. But one specific section caught my attention. The wire had not rusted and snapped. It had been cleanly severed. I knelt down in the snow, brushing my heavy gloves over the metal. The cut was precise, and the exposed steel at the edge of the wire was still shiny. It had not oxidized yet. That meant the cut was recent. Very recent. Someone had used heavy-duty industrial bolt cutters to breach the property line within the last few weeks. My heart rate elevated slightly. I stood up and looked past the breached fence into the dense brush. The snow was falling heavily, attempting to blanket the landscape, but to a trained environmental assessor, the signs of human intrusion were glaringly obvious. The tree branches on either side of the cut fence were snapped backward. The brush had been crushed flat. I stepped through the opening and followed the unnatural path. Beneath the fresh layer of powder, I could see distinct wide ruts carved deep into the frozen mud. These were not tracks from a standard pickup truck or a recreational snowmobile. The distance between the treads and the sheer depth of the displacement indicated heavy machinery. Someone had driven a massive tracked vehicle straight onto my property. I followed the tracks for a quarter of a mile, pushing deeper into the isolated acreage. The path opened up into a wide clearing where the trees had been aggressively cleared away. I stopped dead in my tracks. The clearing was unnatural. The topography had been disturbed. There were three large, distinct mounds of displaced earth covered by a thin layer of fresh snow. I dropped to my knees beside the closest mound and began furiously digging through the ice and dirt with my gloved hands. My fingers struck something hard and smooth. It was not rock, it was industrial plastic. I cleared the dirt away to reveal a thick, heavy-duty PVC cap driven flush into the frozen ground. I scrambled to the second mound and dug again, finding an identical cap. I moved to the third mound and found another. My breath caught in my throat, forming white clouds in the freezing air. I did not need to remove the caps to know exactly what I was looking at. I had supervised dozens of these exact operations in my career. These were exploratory drilling markers. Specifically, they were deep earth rotary core sampling boreholes. Someone had brought a multi-million-dollar industrial drilling rig out to this desolate frozen wasteland. They had illegally breached my property line, set up a massive operation, and drilled hundreds of feet straight down into the bedrock to extract core samples of the earth. And then they had capped the holes and carefully retreated, trying to hide their tracks before the heavy winter storms hit. I stood up slowly, staring at the three white caps resting in the frozen dirt. The cold wind whipped around me, but I suddenly felt entirely awake. The adrenaline spiked in my veins, washing away the exhaustion of the flight and the bitterness of the reading. My parents, Richard and Vivian Williams, were ruthless, calculating corporate sharks. They worshipped money and they despised dead weight. They built their entire fortune by making meticulous, aggressive financial investments. They would never have purchased a massive plot of uninhabitable freezing land in the middle of nowhere just for the fun of it. They did not do rustic family vacations. They did not care about nature. Every single asset they owned was a calculated maneuver. They bought this land over 20 years ago. They held on to it, paying the bare minimum in rural property taxes, letting the cabin rot, and deliberately ignoring it. They never told Marcus about it. They never told anyone about it. The pieces began snapping together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Decades ago, my parents must have received a preliminary tip. Perhaps an old geological survey map, or an insider rumor from one of their corporate connections about what was hiding beneath this specific patch of dirt. They bought the land cheap and sat on it. They were waiting. They were waiting for the market demand to rise, or for extraction technology to become advanced enough to make the dig profitable. But they died before they could execute their final masterstroke. And then there was Marcus. Marcus, the arrogant venture capitalist who thought he knew everything about building wealth. He looked at the deed to this property and saw exactly what a narrow-minded finance bro would see: a rotting cabin and a tax liability. He handed it to me as a cruel joke, fully believing he had secured all the real value in Miami. But whoever brought that drilling rig out here knew the truth. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they were willing to commit federal trespassing and illegal surveying to verify it. They were sneaking onto the property, testing the earth and confirming the data so they could swoop in and steal it from the clueless Williams family heirs. They thought they were dealing with ignorant trust fund kids. They thought they could lowball Marcus or wait for the property to be abandoned. They did not plan on Marcus signing the deed over to a senior geologist. I looked down at the capped boreholes. The anger and betrayal I felt toward my family completely evaporated, replaced by a sharp, clinical focus. I was not going to sell this land on Monday morning. I turned on my heel, marching back toward the dilapidated cabin with a relentless driving pace. I had a portable mass spectrometer and a ground-penetrating radar scanner sitting in my transport cases. I was going to unseal those boreholes, drop my own sensors into the bedrock, and find out exactly what secret my parents had taken to their graves. I reached the ruined porch of the cabin and kicked the thick layer of snow off my insulated boots. My hands were already unfastening the heavy steel latches of the Pelican transport cases when a deep mechanical rumble shattered the absolute silence of the wilderness. I froze. The sound of heavy diesel engines was unmistakable, and it was moving fast. I stepped back from the cases and moved toward the broken window frame of the cabin, keeping myself concealed in the shadows. Two massive matte black SUVs equipped with heavy-duty snow tracks instead of tires tore through the tree line. They did not approach cautiously. They drove with aggressive, arrogant speed, churning up massive clouds of white powder before slamming on their brakes directly in front of my collapsing porch. The vehicles were positioned deliberately to box in the area, cutting off any potential escape route to the main trail. They were executing a textbook intimidation tactic. The heavy doors of the lead vehicle swung open. Four men stepped out into the freezing wind. They were not local Alaskan bush pilots or lost hikers. They were dressed in high-end extreme weather gear that cost more than most people made in a month, and their jackets bore the sleek silver logo of Apex Energy. They were corporate fixers, the kind of ruthless muscle that massive energy conglomerates deploy to handle off the books acquisitions and silence uncooperative landowners. The man who appeared to be the leader walked to the front of his vehicle. He was tall, with a sharp, predatory face and pale eyes that scanned the rotting cabin with profound disgust. He looked like a man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted by simply throwing enough money or threats at the problem. He stepped up to the edge of my porch, his heavy boots crunching loudly against the frozen wood. "Hello in there," the man shouted, his voice carrying a manufactured tone of false friendliness that made my skin crawl. "We know you are inside, Miss Williams. There is no need to be frightened. We just want to have a quick neighborly chat." I did not hide. I did not cower in the corner of the rotting shack. I pushed the broken door aside and stepped out onto the porch, standing elevated above them. I kept my posture completely rigid and my expression entirely blank. I looked down at the four men, evaluating them with the same cold, clinical detachment I used to analyze rock formations. "You are trespassing on private property," I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the howling wind. "Return to your vehicles and leave immediately." The leader let out a patronizing chuckle and shook his head. He looked back at his men, sharing a knowing smirk before turning his attention back to me. "Now there is no need to be hostile, Naomi. May I call you Naomi? My name is Vance. I am a regional acquisitions director for Apex Energy. We have been monitoring the probate filings down in Seattle. We know your parents recently passed away, and we know your brother left you holding the bag on this absolute disaster of an inheritance." Vance took another step forward, invading my space. He reached inside his heavy tactical jacket and pulled out a sleek leather folio. He unzipped it and pulled out a crisp cashier check, along with a stack of legal documents. He slapped the paperwork directly onto the rusted hood of a broken-down snowmobile sitting near the porch. He placed a heavy stone on top of it to keep the wind from blowing it away. "We actually came out here to do you a massive favor," Vance continued, raising his voice over the storm. "We know you are entirely alone out here. We know you have absolutely zero financial backing to maintain this property. The county is going to assess environmental hazard fines on this rotting cabin by the end of the year, and you will be drowning in property taxes you cannot afford. Apex Energy is currently expanding our land conservation portfolio. We are buying up these useless parcels of frozen wasteland to hit our corporate tax write-off quotas." He pointed down at the check. "That is a cashier check for $50,000. It is completely clean, ready to be deposited today. We have the transfer of deed right underneath it. You sign the paper, you take the cash, and we will even let you ride back to civilization in the heated back seat of our SUV. You can fly back to Seattle tonight with 50 grand in your pocket and wash your hands of this miserable family joke." I looked at the check. $50,000. It was the exact amount Marcus had held over my head for my wedding fund. It was the exact amount Jamal had sold my dignity to obtain. Apex Energy had clearly done their homework. They had profiled me. They saw an African-American woman who had just been disinherited, dumped by her fiancé, and left entirely alone in the brutal Alaskan wilderness. They calculated my desperation and decided that $50,000 was the magic number that would make me drop to my knees and surrender. They thought they were dealing with a terrified, broken victim. They had no idea they were attempting to scam a senior geologist who had just found their illegal drill sites. I did not look at the check again. I slowly pulled my smartphone out of my tactical pocket. I unlocked the screen and raised it, holding it remarkably steady. I snapped a high-resolution photograph of Vance's face. Then I methodically moved my camera, capturing the faces of the other three men, the Apex Energy logos on their jackets, and the license plates of both heavily modified SUVs. The flash of the camera strobed brightly against the gray storm. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Vance snapped, his false friendly demeanor vanishing instantly. He took a threatening step up onto the porch, his physical size meant to intimidate me into dropping the phone. "I am documenting federal crimes, Vance." I replied, my voice absolutely lethal in its calm precision. I tapped the screen, saving the images to a secure cloud server. According to the Alaska statutes regarding criminal trespass in the first degree, entering private land with the intent to commit a crime is a Class A misdemeanor. However, when that trespass is combined with illegal industrial surveying, corporate espionage, and unauthorized rotary core sampling on private property, it escalates to a multi-million-dollar federal offense. Vance froze. The color instantly drained from his sharp face. The other three men shifted nervously, looking at each other in sudden rising panic. The words rotary core sampling hit them exactly like a physical blow to the chest. "You guys are incredibly sloppy." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Vance to step back down off my porch. "If you are going to commit illegal geological surveying, you should probably make sure the landowner you are trying to scam is not a senior environmental impact assessor." I just walked the northern boundary line. I found your severed barbed wire. I tracked your heavy machinery ruts. And I found all three of your capped deep earth boreholes. "Listen here, you little," Vance started, his voice dropping into a vicious, menacing snarl. He reached his hand out as if to grab me, but I did not even flinch. I just stared right through him. "If you touch me, or if you take one more step onto this porch, my legal team in Seattle will have the federal authorities seize every single piece of machinery Apex Energy currently operates in this state." I interrupted, my voice echoing like cracking ice. "You did not come out here to offer me a charity buyout for a tax write-off. You came out here because your illegal core samples hit massive deposits of raw minerals, and you panicked when you realized the Williams estate was suddenly changing hands. You wanted to bully a grieving daughter into signing away the mineral rights for pennies before she realized she was sitting on a gold mine." Vance opened his mouth to speak, but I completely talked over him, refusing to yield a single inch of power. "Pick up your pathetic $50,000 check, Vance. Pick up your fraudulent contract. Get back into your oversized corporate trucks and get off my land. If you or any other representative of Apex Energy crosses my property line again, I will not call the local police. I will call the Environmental Protection Agency and report illegal drilling causing potential groundwater contamination. I will tank your corporate stock price before the market opens on Monday morning." The silence that followed was absolute. The howling wind seemed to fade into the background as the sheer gravity of my threat settled over the four men. They had come here expecting a sheep. They had found an apex predator. Vance stared at me. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched rapidly in his cheek. He realized in that exact moment that he had severely miscalculated the situation. I was not intimidated by his physical size. I was not desperate for his money. And I held enough legal and scientific leverage to completely destroy his career. He slowly reached out, snatched the check and the legal documents off the rusted snowmobile, and shoved them aggressively back into his leather folio. He did not say another word. He turned around, giving a sharp jerk of his head to his men. The three enforcers scrambled quickly back into their vehicles, completely abandoning their intimidating posture. Vance climbed into the passenger seat of the lead SUV and slammed the heavy armored door shut. The diesel engines roared back to life. The tracks spun violently against the ice, tearing up the snow, as the two massive vehicles aggressively reversed, spun around and sped back down the trail toward the highway. I stood on the porch and watched until the red tail lights completely disappeared into the blinding white snowstorm. I did not shake. I did not collapse in relief. I simply turned around, walked back into the freezing cabin, and opened my heavy transport case. I pulled out my portable mass spectrometer and my ground-penetrating radar equipment. Apex Energy had just confirmed my greatest suspicion. Now it was time for me to go back to those boreholes and find out exactly how many millions of dollars my parents had hidden under the ice. I strapped the heavy Pelican cases onto my utility sled and marched back into the storm. The wind was whipping snow into my face, but the cold barely registered. I was operating on pure adrenaline and a singular razor-sharp focus. I navigated the dense tree line, moving with the practiced efficiency of a professional who had spent thousands of hours in the field. When I reached the clearing where Apex Energy had illegally breached my property, I did not hesitate. I set up my portable workstation next to the first capped borehole. I unpacked my ground-penetrating radar scanner, calibrating the frequencies to penetrate deep into the frozen bedrock. The device hummed to life, the screen illuminating the blinding white surroundings with a stark blue glow. I dragged the scanner back and forth across the clearing, mapping the subterranean topography with meticulous precision. The initial readings were staggering. The geological formations beneath the surface were incredibly dense and heavily stratified, indicating massive, unnatural concentrations of highly conductive materials. But radar anomalies were not enough to legally bind a $100 million contract. I needed tangible, undeniable proof. I moved to the capped borehole and pulled a heavy titanium wrench from my toolkit. I locked it onto the PVC cap and threw my entire body weight into snapping the industrial seal. The cap cracked open with a sharp hiss of pressurized air. I attached my deep soil sampling rig to the exposed pipe and sent the extraction cylinder hundreds of feet down into the earth. The winch groaned under the strain as it pulled the heavy core sample back to the surface. When the cylinder finally breached the surface, I cracked it open and carefully slid the core sample onto a sterile examination tray. It was a beautiful, perfectly intact cylindrical cross-section of the earth. I put on my magnification goggles and illuminated the sample with a high-intensity UV light. I traced my gloved finger over the dark, heavily striated rock. Streaks of pure, raw lithium carbonate glittered brightly under the ultraviolet beam. But it was not just lithium. The surrounding matrix was thick with dense, heavy metals. Promethium, neodymium, and dysprosium. These were rare earth elements. The absolute holy grail of modern technology manufacturing. I extracted 2 more core samples from the remaining boreholes, meticulously bagging and tagging each section in sterile, tamper-proof containers. I cataloged the GPS coordinates, the depth metrics, and the preliminary visual analyses into my encrypted tablet. By the time I finished, the winter sun had completely vanished behind the mountains, plunging the wilderness into absolute darkness. I dragged my sled back to the cabin, locked myself inside, and spent the next 3 hours preparing the samples for secure transport. The bush pilot returned exactly on schedule 3 days later. I loaded my equipment and the locked transport cases into the small plane, and we flew back to Fairbanks. From there, I immediately booked the first commercial flight straight back to Seattle. I did not go to my apartment. I did not contact Jamal. I took a secure cab directly from the airport to an independent, highly classified geological testing facility that specialized in rapid corporate asset evaluation. I had worked with the lab director, Dr. Eris Thorne, on several sensitive government contracts in the past. He was brilliant, notoriously discreet, and fiercely loyal to raw scientific data over corporate pressure. I placed the locked transport cases on his stainless steel examination table and handed him the encrypted drive containing my preliminary radar mapping. Dr. Thorne, I need a comprehensive quantitative analysis of these core samples. I stated, my voice completely stripped of emotion. I need the exact purity percentages, the estimated volume yields based on the radar topography, and a fully certified legal validation of the findings. And I need this completely off the books until the final report is generated. Dr. Thorne adjusted his glasses and looked down at the heavy cases. He recognized the specific type of secure containers used for high-value mineral transport. Naomi, you know my rapid turnaround fee for classified corporate analysis is exorbitant, he said carefully. I am not running a charity here. I pulled the $50 bill Jamal had thrown on the restaurant table out of my pocket and placed it smoothly onto the metal table. Consider this a placeholder, I said, maintaining absolute eye contact. When you run the spectrometer analysis on those samples, you will understand exactly why I brought them to you. You will have your full fee plus a substantial bonus deposited into your account within 30 days. I guarantee it. He looked at the bill, then at the intense, unyielding expression on my face. He slowly reached out and pulled the heavy cases toward him. I will have my team work through the weekend, he agreed. I will call you the absolute second the data compiles. I finally returned to my apartment and immediately changed the locks. I packed every single item belonging to Jamal into cheap black garbage bags and dragged them out to the hallway, leaving them sitting next to the elevator bank. I blocked his number and deleted every social media connection bridging us together. I severed the past, completely cleaning my life like a surgeon prepping an operating room. Then the waiting began. For 5 agonizing days, I paced the floors of my apartment. I researched global market values for lithium and rare earth elements. I tracked the stock prices of Apex Energy and their largest international competitors. I built a comprehensive multi-tiered negotiation strategy, mapping out exactly how I would leverage the data once I had the official validation. I did not sleep. I existed purely on black coffee and absolute ruthless anticipation. At exactly 3:14 in the morning on a Thursday, my encrypted mobile phone shattered the silence of my dark apartment. The caller ID flashed Dr. Eris Thorne. I snatched the phone off the desk and answered on the first ring. Naomi. Dr. Thorne's voice crackled through the speaker. He did not sound professional or detached. He sounded completely breathless, as if he had just run a marathon. I have been running these samples through the mass spectrometer for the last 72 hours. I actually recalibrated the machines twice because I completely refused to believe the initial readout data. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I forced my voice to remain cold and steady. Give me the numbers, Aris. The purity levels are absolutely staggering. He continued, his voice trembling slightly. We are looking at a lithium carbonate concentration that exceeds the current industry average by nearly 40%. But the rare earth matrix surrounding it is what is truly anomalous. Based on the radar topography you provided and the core sample density, this is not just a deposit. It is a massive concentrated subterranean vein. Naomi, whoever owns the mineral rights to this property, is sitting on one of the most significant domestic resource discoveries of the decade. The estimated baseline valuation for the raw extraction rights alone is easily clearing $100 million. I closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath into the dark, empty room. The numbers were real. The wealth was real. My parents had known exactly what they were doing when they bought that land, and they had unknowingly handed the keys to the kingdom directly to the one daughter they thought was too stupid to understand its value. Send the certified legal report to my secure email immediately, I instructed, my voice dropping into a deadly calm register. And Iris locked down all physical copies of the data. Nobody breathes a single word about this until I make my move. I ended the call and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window of my apartment, looking out over the sleeping city of Seattle. Marcus and Chloe were probably sleeping soundly in their Miami mansion, dreaming of their inherited millions. Jamal was probably groveling to some other venture capitalist, trying to hustle his way into high society. They had all looked at me and seen a pathetic broken victim. They had no idea that I was currently holding a geological weapon capable of annihilating every single one of them. The encrypted email from Dr. Thorne arrived in my inbox exactly at 6 in the morning. I was already sitting at my kitchen island, a fresh cup of black coffee cooling beside my laptop. I opened the file with a steady hand. The heavily redacted 70-page document was a masterpiece of geological analysis. Aris had not exaggerated during our phone call. The data was absolutely staggering. Page after page detailed the subterranean mapping, confirming a massive continuous vein of raw minerals running directly beneath the rotting floorboards of my Alaskan cabin. The report broke down the exact concentrations. The lithium carbonate equivalent was astronomical, but the true crown jewel of the discovery was the rare earth matrix: neodymium, praseodymium, and dysprosium. These were the exact elements required to manufacture the permanent magnets used in electric vehicle motors and advanced military technology. I scrolled through the market projections Eris had attached to the final pages. We are living in the dawn of the electric vehicle revolution. The global supply chain is desperately scrambling for domestic sources of these specific minerals to reduce reliance on foreign imports. Automakers and energy conglomerates are practically bleeding cash to secure stateside mining rights. According to the current market index, the proven reserves sitting on my property were assigned a conservative baseline valuation of $120 million. I leaned back in my chair and stared at that number. 120 million. The profound, bitter irony of the situation washed over me. I thought back to my parents, Richard and Vivian Williams. They were unapologetic corporate sharks who built their entire identity around aggressive wealth accumulation. They despised failure. They despised anything that did not yield a massive return on investment. For 20 years, I believed they had simply bought a worthless plot of frozen land as some sort of obscure tax write-off. But looking at this data, I finally understood the terrifying brilliance of their minds. They did not buy that land by accident. In the late 90s, long before the electric vehicle boom, my father was sitting on the board of several prominent investment firms. He must have gained access to a classified geological survey or caught wind of an insider tip regarding unmapped mineral deposits in the rural Yukon region. He bought the land for absolute pennies and buried it deep inside his vast real estate portfolio. They were playing a decades-long waiting game. They knew the technology to extract those specific rare earth elements profitably did not exist back then. So they sat on the land, letting the cabin rot, paying the minimal rural taxes, and waiting for the global market to catch up to their secret. They died before they could cash in the winning lottery ticket they had hidden in their own backyard. Then came the reading of the will. My parents had designed their estate to ensure Marcus received the immediate liquid wealth because they viewed him as their true successor. But I now realized they had purposely assigned the Alaskan property to me. Not as a punishment, but because they knew I was the only person in the family with the scientific background required to eventually understand what that land actually held. They thought I would eventually survey it, discover the minerals, and bring the data back to Marcus so he could manage the corporate extraction. Even from the grave, they expected me to do the gritty scientific labor so my brother could reap the financial glory. But Marcus was too arrogant to see the bigger picture. When he looked at the deed, he did not see potential. He only saw a dilapidated cabin and a lack of immediate cash flow. His entire financial philosophy was built on fast venture capital returns and flashy Miami real estate. He lacked the fundamental patience and the scientific intellect to investigate an asset before discarding it. He handed me the keys to a $100 million empire simply because he was too lazy to look beneath the surface. And then there was Apex Energy, the corporate fixers who had shown up on my porch with a $50,000 check. They had been monitoring the region, mapping the geological shifts, and conducting illegal core sampling. They knew the Williams estate was in probate, and they thought they could swoop in and steal the mineral rights from a grieving, disconnected daughter. If I had been anyone else, if I had been the weak, pathetic loser my family claimed I was, I would have eagerly signed that contract just to escape the freezing cold. I would have traded generational wealth for a quick payout. I closed the laptop screen. A cold, calculated clarity settled over my mind. I was not going to sell that land. Selling the property outright would trigger massive capital gains taxes and completely remove my control over the asset. Apex Energy wanted to buy the dirt cheap so they could control the entire profit margin of the extraction process. I refused to let another corporate entity dictate my worth. I am a senior environmental impact assessor. I know exactly how natural resource acquisitions operate. I was going to execute a strategy that would secure my wealth permanently, while keeping my identity completely hidden from the public eye. I was not going to sell the land. I was going to lease the exclusive mineral extraction rights. By retaining ownership of the deed, I could act as the sovereign landlord of the deposit. I would demand a massive upfront sign-on bonus just to grant a mining corporation access to the property. Furthermore, I would structure the contract to include a gross overriding royalty. That meant I would receive a fixed percentage of the revenue from every single ounce of lithium and rare earth mineral pulled from the ground before any operational costs or corporate taxes were deducted. I would generate passive millions while the mining company absorbed all the operational risks. But to pull off a maneuver of this magnitude, I needed absolute airtight secrecy. If Marcus or Chloe caught even a whisper of $100 million mineral deposit, they would immediately file aggressive injunctions in probate court. They would hire armies of vicious lawyers to claim my parents made a mistake in the asset distribution, or argue that the mineral rights were never explicitly transferred with the surface deed. If Jamal found out, he would undoubtedly try to crawl back and leverage our past relationship to extort a settlement. I needed to build an impenetrable legal fortress around myself before I made a single public move. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had acquired during a previous environmental consulting job. It was the direct line to the managing partner of Sterling and Vance, a boutique powerhouse law firm in downtown Seattle that exclusively handled high-stakes natural resource acquisitions and corporate defense. They were notoriously ruthless, incredibly expensive, and completely discreet. When the managing partner answered, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I introduced myself, verified my professional credentials, and stated that I possessed certified independent laboratory data confirming a Tier 1 rare earth mineral deposit on private land that I owned free and clear. I told him I needed to establish an irrevocable blind trust immediately. A blind trust was the ultimate shield. It is a legal financial vehicle where the beneficiaries have no direct control or knowledge of the assets managed by an independent trustee. But more importantly, it masks the identity of the true owner from the public record. Any corporate negotiations, any signed contracts, and any massive financial transfers would be executed under the name of the trust, not Naomi Williams. To the outside world, the Alaskan property would appear to be managed by a faceless corporate entity. I scheduled an in-person meeting with the legal team for that exact afternoon. I was going to lock down the property, secure the data, and begin the process of pitting the largest energy conglomerates in the world against each other in a bidding war for my land. I looked at the $50 bill Jamal had left me, which I had brought back from the laboratory. I folded it neatly and slipped it into my pocket. My family and my ex-fiancé had chosen their paths. They had chosen to worship the superficial illusion of wealth. I was about to secure the real thing. And I was going to do it completely in the shadows, letting them continue to believe I was drowning while I quietly bought the ocean. The offices of Sterling and Vance occupied the top 3 floors of the tallest skyscraper in downtown Seattle. When I stepped off the private elevator, I was immediately ushered into a soundproof conference room overlooking the Puget Sound. I sat across from 3 of the most ruthless corporate attorneys on the West Coast. I did not waste their time with family drama or emotional baggage. I slid the certified geological report from Dr. Thorne across the polished glass table and told them exactly what I wanted to achieve. Within 2 hours, we had completely restructured my financial identity. They established an irrevocable blind trust, naming it the Obsidian Holdings Trust. The deed to the Alaskan property was legally transferred into the trust, completely severing my public association with the land. To the outside world, Naomi Williams still owned nothing but a modest apartment and an environmental consulting salary. But in reality, I was now the sole hidden beneficiary of a corporate entity holding a Tier 1 mineral deposit. With the defensive shields in place, it was time to go on the offensive. I knew Apex Energy was aggressively trying to secure domestic lithium sources to dominate the electric vehicle supply chain. They had tried to steal my land for $50,000. I was not going to negotiate with thieves. Instead, I targeted their absolute biggest corporate rival. Vanguard Mining Conglomerate was a massive international extraction company that had recently lost 3 major bidding wars to Apex. Vanguard was bleeding investors because they lacked stateside mineral reserves. They were desperate hungry and actively looking for a massive win to stabilize their plummeting stock price. They were the perfect target. I directed my lead attorney to contact Vanguard Acquisition Department. We did not send a pitch deck or a friendly email. We sent a heavily redacted single-page executive summary of the core sample data and gave them exactly 48 hours to arrange an in-person meeting in Seattle before we took the data to another buyer. Vanguard sent their senior vice president of domestic acquisitions on a private jet the very next morning. The negotiation took place in the same soundproof conference room at Sterling and Vance. The Vanguard executives walked in wearing custom suits projecting an aura of absolute corporate dominance. They assumed they were dealing with some lucky inherited trust fund that had stumbled onto a minor mineral deposit. I sat at the head of the table flanked by my legal team wearing a sharp-tailored suit. I did not smile. I did not offer them coffee. I pushed the full unredacted geological report across the table and watched their expressions transform. The senior vice president scanned the purity levels of the lithium and the rare earth matrix. His professional facade completely cracked. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer predatory greed. He immediately tried to execute a classic corporate strong-arm tactic. He offered to buy the land outright for $20 million cash. To an ordinary person, $20 million is lottery money. To a senior geologist looking at a $100 million reserve, it was an insulting joke. I leaned forward, lacing my fingers together on the top of the glass table. I let the silence stretch for several agonizing seconds before I spoke. I am not a helpless landowner you can lowball with a quick cash buyout. I stated, my voice resonating with cold, absolute authority. I am a senior environmental impact assessor, and I know exactly what is buried under that permafrost. You are not buying my land today. The deed remains permanently in the Obsidian Holdings Trust. What we are discussing is an exclusive mineral lease agreement, and Vanguard is going to pay heavily for the privilege of breaking my ground. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, exchanging nervous glances. They were completely unprepared to face an opponent who understood both the geological science and the corporate extraction market. I laid out my terms with zero room for negotiation. Vanguard would absorb 100% of the operational costs, the environmental compliance liabilities, and the extraction infrastructure development. In exchange for the exclusive right to mine the property, they would pay an immediate upfront sign-on bonus. Furthermore, I demanded a gross overriding royalty. The vice president attempted to argue pushing for a net profit royalty instead. That is the oldest trick in the corporate mining playbook. A net profit royalty allows the mining company to deduct all their operating costs, equipment depreciation, and administrative fees before calculating the landowner percentage. They use creative accounting to make the profits look microscopic, so the landowner gets nothing. I cut him off immediately. I said a gross overriding royalty. I repeated my tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate. 12% of the gross revenue generated from every single ounce of lithium and rare earth mineral pulled from that soil before any taxes, deductions, or corporate overhead are applied. Additionally, the immediate sign-on bonus to secure this contract is $15 million cash wired directly into my trust account the second the ink dries. If you do not accept these terms right now, I will walk across the street and hand this data directly to Apex Energy. The threat of handing a massive domestic reserve to their biggest rival was the ultimate kill shot. The vice president literally broke into a sweat. He asked for 10 minutes to make a phone call to his board of directors. He stepped out of the room and returned exactly 9 minutes later, looking pale but entirely defeated. He agreed to every single term. The paperwork was finalized over the next 48 hours. My legal team scrutinized every sentence, closing every potential loophole and securing my anonymity. On Friday afternoon, I sat in the law office as the final contracts were signed and officially notarized. The Vanguard executives shook my hand, treating me with a profound level of respect that bordered on fear. My lead attorney opened his laptop and logged into the secure banking portal for the Obsidian Holdings Trust. He turned the screen toward me. I watched as the international wire transfer cleared the clearinghouse protocols. The account balance refreshed. The screen displayed a 15, followed by 6 zeros. $15 million in liquid untaxed cash had just securely landed in my account. And the 12% gross royalty meant that once the mining operations began, I would be receiving massive passive income checks every single month for the next 30 years. I had officially crossed the threshold into the ultra-wealthy elite. I had secured a level of generational wealth that completely dwarfed the Miami mansion and the investment portfolios my brother Marcus had inherited. My parents had spent their entire lives clawing for a seat at the table of elite society, compromising their morals and crushing their own daughter just to project an image of wealth. In less than 2 weeks, I had completely surpassed their lifelong financial achievements without sacrificing a single ounce of my scientific integrity. I walked out of the law firm and stepped onto the busy streets of downtown Seattle. I was a multimillionaire, but nobody looking at me would ever know. I did not immediately go out and buy sports cars or designer wardrobes. I maintained my absolute discipline. I returned to my modest apartment and continued working my environmental consulting job. I embraced the power of total anonymity. My family believed I was a pathetic, heartbroken failure, freezing in a rotting Alaskan cabin. They believed they had completely destroyed my future. I decided to let them keep believing their comfortable lies. I was going to wait patiently in the shadows, letting them build their fragile lives on a foundation of arrogance and borrowed money. I knew that soon enough the weight of their own greed would cause their entire world to collapse. And when that day finally came, I would be standing right there ready to watch them fall. The blinding afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the pristine white stucco of the Star Island estate. Outside, the temperature was a sweltering 95 degrees, but the heat radiating inside the mansion home office had absolutely nothing to do with the Miami weather. Marcus sat slumped behind a massive glass desk, his custom-tailored Tom Ford shirt entirely soaked with nervous sweat. The air conditioning unit was rattling loudly, struggling to cool the massive house, but Marcus could barely hear it over the sound of his own rapid, panicked breathing. He stared at the trio of computer monitors mounted on his desk. The screens were a bloodbath of descending red lines and negative profit margins. Exactly 6 months had passed since he walked out of that Seattle law firm feeling like an unstoppable king. 6 months was all it took for his massive ego to completely destroy a generational empire. Marcus was never the financial genius my parents believed him to be. He was a gambler who used his family wealth to cover his reckless mistakes. When he inherited the $3.5 million in liquid cash, he did not secure it. He immediately leveraged it to cover massive margin calls on a series of highly volatile cryptocurrency startups and aggressive venture capital funds. He wanted to prove to his wealthy peers that he was an industry titan. Instead, the market shifted violently. His highest-yielding investments filed for bankruptcy protection one by one. The liquid cash evaporated into thin air, swallowed whole by corporate debt and catastrophic mismanagement. The heavy mahogany door to the office swung open. Chloe strolled in wearing a sheer silk cover up over a designer swimsuit holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She looked completely detached from reality. 4 massive shopping bags from the Bal Harbour boutiques dangled from her wrist. "Marcus, you really need to call the pool maintenance company," Chloe complained, taking a delicate sip of her water. "The heating system is completely malfunctioning and the water is absolutely freezing. I have 5 of the country club wives coming over for brunch tomorrow, and I refuse to be embarrassed by a freezing pool." Marcus slowly lifted his head and looked at his wife. The veins in his neck were pulsing visibly. He did not say a word about the pool. He could not afford to pay the pool maintenance company. He could not afford the designer clothes currently swinging from her wrist. 3 months ago, when the venture capital funds first began to bleed out, Marcus had made a desperate, illegal maneuver. Without telling anyone, he had taken out a massive high-interest second mortgage on the $1.2 million Miami estate. He used the house as collateral to borrow against his failing businesses, hoping for a miracle market bounce-back that never came. Before Marcus could formulate a lie to pacify his wife, the sharp, aggressive sound of the front doorbell echoed through the expansive marble foyer. It was not a polite ring. It was a heavy, insistent pounding. Chloe rolled her eyes and gestured vaguely toward the hallway. Tell the housekeeper to get that. I am not answering the door looking like this. We do not have a housekeeper anymore, Chloe. Marcus snapped, his voice cracking with dry panic. I fired her 2 weeks ago. He pushed himself up from the desk, his legs feeling like lead, and walked out to the foyer. He pulled the heavy front door open. A man in a cheap gray suit stood on the porch holding a thick manila envelope. The man did not smile. He simply asked to confirm Marcus' identity, handed the envelope over, and walked away. Marcus tore the envelope open right there in the entryway. His eyes frantically scanned the dense legal jargon printed on the thick stationery. It was a notice of default and intent to foreclose. The bank was officially calling the loan. Because Marcus had missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments, the financial institution was seizing the property. He had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the local sheriff department arrived to forcibly evict them and put the Star Island estate up for public auction. The paper slipped from his trembling hands and fluttered to the marble floor. The Williams family legacy. The flawless image of black excellence my parents had sacrificed everything to build was officially dead. It had been reduced to a foreclosure notice on a Miami porch. A frantic scuffling sound came from the kitchen corridor. Jamal scurried into the foyer holding a stack of unopened mail and a ringing cell phone. Jamal was no longer the arrogant, confident tech founder who had sold me out in Seattle. His software application had completely collapsed 4 months ago after he squandered his remaining capital on lavish networking parties trying to impress investors who saw right through his facade. Bankrupt and desperate Jamal had crawled to Marcus begging for a position. Marcus had hired him for pennies, turning the man I once loved into a glorified administrative assistant who fetched coffee and screened calls from angry creditors. Marcus, the accountants from the New York branch are on line 1. Jamal said, his voice tight with anxiety. They are saying the corporate accounts are frozen. The credit lines are completely maxed out. What do you want me to tell them? Marcus did not answer. He stared blankly at the foreclosure notice on the floor. Chloe walked into the foyer, her annoyed expression faltering when she saw the sheer terror painted across her husband's face. She looked down at the legal document, picked it up, and read the bold, bolded letters at the top of the page. The crystal glass slipped from her hand and shattered violently against the marble tiles. Water and sharp shards exploded across the floor. You mortgaged the house, Chloe screamed, her voice reaching a hysterical shrill pitch. You put a lien on my home. Where are we supposed to go, Marcus? My friends are coming here tomorrow. You are a complete fraud. Shut up, Chloe. Marcus roared back, the last remnants of his sanity snapping. The money is gone. Everything is gone. We are bankrupt. The foyer descended into absolute chaos. Chloe began sobbing hysterically, throwing her designer shopping bags at Marcus' chest. Marcus grabbed his hair, pacing frantically back and forth over the shattered glass, muttering to himself about offshore accounts that did not actually exist. Jamal stood frozen in the corner, clutching the ringing cell phone like a lifeline. He watched the multi-million-dollar lifestyle he had sold his soul to be a part of burn to the ground in a matter of seconds. He was about to be unemployed, homeless, and completely destitute. His survival instinct, a deeply ingrained pattern of parasitic desperation, kicked into high gear. His mind raced frantically, searching for any possible asset they could liquidate to stop the bleeding. Then a dark, despicable realization crossed his face. He stepped forward, carefully navigating the broken glass, and grabbed Marcus by the shoulder. Marcus, listen to me, Jamal said, raising his voice to cut through Chloe, hysterical crying. I know how we can get a massive injection of cash. I know how we can stall the bank and save the house. Marcus stopped pacing and looked at Jamal with wild, desperate eyes. How? We have no collateral left. Every single account is drained. We do not have collateral, Jamal corrected, a sinister, calculating smile spreading across his face. But your sister does. Marcus let out a sharp, dismissive breath. Naomi. She is a pathetic loser freezing in a dirt hut. She has absolutely nothing. That is exactly the point, Marcus. Jamal pushed forward, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. She is completely isolated in Alaska, or maybe she crawled back to her cheap apartment in Seattle. Either way, she is broke, depressed, and entirely desperate. She has no idea how to manage property. But that land she inherited is a massive plot of raw commercial acreage. Even if it is a frozen wasteland, commercial logging corporations or land developers will easily pay $500,000 just for the raw acreage rights. Marcus' eyes narrowed, his mind slowly catching up to the malicious scheme Jamal was proposing. We pool the absolute last remaining limits on your personal credit cards. Jamal continued, his eyes gleaming with malicious greed. We scrape together exactly $100,000 in cash. We fly to Seattle, find Naomi, and we play the role of the generous family. We tell her we feel guilty about the will. We tell her we want to help her out of her miserable financial situation by buying that useless Alaskan dirt off her hands for $100,000. She is broke, Marcus. Jamal insisted, gripping his arm tightly. She is a woman living on a modest salary who just lost her family. If we wave a certified check for $100,000 in her face, she will drop to her knees and cry tears of gratitude. She will sign the deed over instantly. The second the ink is dry, we flip the property to a commercial developer for $500,000. We use the profit to pay the arrears on the mortgage, stop the foreclosure, and buy ourselves enough time to restructure your venture funds. Marcus stared at Jamal, the absolute moral bankruptcy of the plan completely overshadowed by his desperate need to survive. He was going to trick his own sister into selling her only inheritance for a fraction of its value just to save his own skin. He did not feel a single ounce of guilt. He only felt the thrilling rush of a predator spotting wounded prey. "Book the flights," Marcus ordered, his voice dropping into a cold, ruthless register. "We leave for Seattle tonight. We find my pathetic sister, and we take her last remaining asset." The flight to Seattle was a masterclass in performative delusion. Marcus had drained the absolute final available balance on his last functioning corporate credit card to secure 3 first-class tickets. He justified the exorbitant expense to a panicked Chloe by insisting that they needed to maintain the psychological high ground. If Naomi saw them fly economy or stay in a budget motel, their entire illusion of untouchable wealth would shatter. They needed to project absolute financial dominance. They needed to look like billionaires descending from the heavens to toss a few pennies to a starving peasant. During the 6-hour flight, Jamal eagerly played the role of the loyal henchman. He sat across the aisle reviewing the fraudulent purchase contract he had hastily drafted. He had spent the previous night tracking Naomi's digital footprint. He discovered she had broken the lease on their shared downtown condo shortly after the reading of the will. She had effectively vanished from her usual social media channels and severed all ties with their mutual acquaintances. Jamal smugly concluded that she had suffered a total mental breakdown and retreated to some miserable low-income apartment on the outskirts of the city. He assured Marcus that she was likely drowning in debt and entirely isolated, making her the perfect vulnerable target. Jamal had spent hours prior to the flight agonizing over the perfect text message to lure Naomi to their meeting. He could not sound too eager, but he needed to ensure she actually showed up. He had finally settled on a message claiming Marcus wanted to formally apologize for his behavior at the attorney office and offer a financial peace offering to settle the bad blood. They knew Naomi's pride might make her hesitate, but they gambled that her supposed poverty would ultimately force her to attend. A starving person rarely turns down a free meal. They landed in Seattle under a blanket of heavy gray rain. Marcus did not rent a standard car. He hired a chauffeured black car service to drive them directly to the Rainier Grand Hotel. It was widely considered the most opulent luxury hotel in the Pacific Northwest, featuring towering marble pillars, cascading crystal chandeliers, and an atmosphere designed specifically to make ordinary working-class people feel profoundly inadequate. This was exactly why Marcus chose it. He wanted to pull Naomi out of her supposedly pathetic life and drop her into an environment that would completely overwhelm her senses and crush her confidence before they even began negotiating. Marcus reserved a private seating area in the center of the hotel grand lobby bar. He arranged himself on a tufted velvet sofa, adjusting his expensive suit jacket to hide the nervous sweat dampening his collar. Chloe sat beside him, crossing her legs and placing her designer handbag prominently on the table. She spent 10 minutes applying a fresh coat of lipstick and practicing a look of profound benevolent pity in the reflection of her compact mirror. Jamal stood behind them, hovering like an anxious servant, constantly checking the entrance. When the sommelier approached their table, Marcus did not even glance at the standard menu. He demanded the reserve list. With a forced, arrogant smile, he ordered a $2,000 bottle of vintage Bordeaux. When the waiter brought the bottle and poured the tasting measure, Marcus' hand trembled slightly. That single bottle of wine represented the absolute last drop of his usable credit. If this plan failed, he would not even have enough money to pay for the hotel room tonight. But he swallowed his panic, masked it with a smooth, arrogant grin, and nodded his approval to the sommelier. "We need to execute this flawlessly," Marcus stated, taking a slow sip of the dark red wine. He leaned forward, locking eyes with Chloe and Jamal. "When she walks through those doors, we control the entire narrative. We are not desperate. We are a massively successful family taking pity on a wayward sibling." Chloe nodded, swirling the expensive wine in her crystal glass. "I will do most of the emotional lifting," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I will tell her how much it breaks my heart to see her struggling. I will mention how expensive the world has become, and how we just want to make sure she has a little safety net. She will eat it up. People like her are always desperate for validation from people like us." "And what about you, Jamal?" Marcus asked, shooting a sharp, evaluating look at his former prospective brother-in-law. "Are you going to be able to sell the remorseful ex-boyfriend routine, or are you going to crack under pressure?" Jamal straightened his posture, puffing out his chest to project a false sense of confidence. "I have it completely handled, Marcus," he promised eagerly. "I will tell her that leaving her was a massive mistake, but I know I cannot ask for her back until she is financially stable. I will convince her that selling that Alaskan dirt to you is the only way we can ever have a real future together. She loved me for 5 years, Marcus. She is a desperate, lonely woman holding on to the past. I know exactly which emotional buttons to push to make her sign that contract. She will practically thank us for taking that land off her hands." Marcus smirked, taking another sip of the Bordeaux. "Perfect." He set the glass down and placed the purchase contract onto the center of the table right next to a sleek silver pen. He smoothed the edges of the paper, treating it like a sacred artifact that would single-handedly rescue his entire existence. "She thinks she is so smart with her science degree and her environmental morals." Marcus sneered, his voice laced with decades of deep-seated resentment. "But the real world runs on capital and leverage. We have the leverage, we have the capital. We are going to offer her $100,000 and act like we are doing her the biggest favor in the history of this family. She will probably cry tears of gratitude right here in the lobby." The three of them sat back in the plush velvet seating, drinking their stolen wine and feeding off each other toxic delusions. They were completely convinced they were apex predators, laying a flawless trap for a helpless victim. They genuinely believed Naomi was going to walk through those heavy brass doors, wearing cheap clothes, looking exhausted and thoroughly defeated by the world. They were completely unprepared for the reality of what was actually about to walk into that hotel lobby. The heavy brass doors of the Rainier Grand Hotel swung open, pulled back by two uniformed valets. The chaotic noise of the Seattle rainstorm was instantly silenced as Naomi stepped onto the polished marble floor of the lobby. She did not look like a broken woman crawling back to her family for scraps. She looked like a corporate titan stepping into her own boardroom. She wore a bespoke charcoal wool suit tailored to absolute perfection that draped flawlessly over her frame. The cut was modern, sharp, and exuded an effortless, commanding authority. Beneath the jacket, she wore a simple silk blouse. But it was the accessory on her left wrist that truly captured the ambient light of the crystal chandeliers. A solid platinum watch, its bezel encrusted with flawless factory-set diamonds, gleamed with quiet, aggressive wealth. It was a timepiece that cost more than the luxury SUV Marcus used to lease. From their velvet booth in the center of the room, Marcus, Chloe, and Jamal watched her approach. For one fraction of a second, absolute terror flashed across Marcus' face. His financial predator instincts recognized the authentic aura of extreme wealth radiating from his sister. But his massive, fragile ego instantly violently rejected the reality in front of his eyes. His mind frantically constructed a delusional narrative to protect his crumbling sanity. She rented it. Marcus whispered to Chloe, gripping his wineglass so tightly the stem threatened to snap. Look at her. She is trying to project power. She probably blew her absolute last credit card limit on a personal shopper and a rented watch just to save face in front of us. It is pathetic. Chloe immediately latched onto the delusion, her artificial smile returning in full force. Of course she did, Chloe murmured, taking a sip of her Bordeaux. She is terrified of looking like the failure she actually is. Let me handle her, Marcus. I know exactly how to break through that fake armor. Naomi reached the table. She did not sit down immediately. She stood looking down at the three of them, her expression entirely unreadable. She noted the sweating glass of wine, the forced, relaxed posture Marcus was attempting to hold, and the absolute desperation vibrating off Jamal. They looked like cornered animals trying to act like apex predators. Naomi, Marcus said, gesturing broadly toward the empty velvet chair across from him. Have a seat. You look exhausted. Naomi slowly took the seat, crossing her legs and resting her hands on the table. The diamond watch flashed brightly, catching Jamal's eye. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously as he tried to calculate how a woman he abandoned with nothing was suddenly wearing a piece of jewelry that cost more than his entire failed tech startup. Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table and putting on her most maternal, condescending voice. Naomi, sweetie, it is so brave of you to show up today, and you really did not have to go through all this trouble just for us. She gestured vaguely at Naomi's tailored suit. We are your family. We know exactly how difficult things have been for you since the reading of the will. You did not have to go to a rental boutique and put yourself further into debt just to pretend you are doing well. We love you no matter how bad your financial situation has gotten. I am not in debt, Chloe, Naomi stated, her voice perfectly level, completely ignoring the bait. Why did you call me here, Marcus? Marcus let out a heavy, practiced sigh, acting like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned across the table, attempting to shrink the physical space between them. Listen, Naomi, I have been doing a lot of thinking since that day in the attorney office. I have to admit, I let my emotions get the better of me. Mom and Dad passing away put a massive amount of stress on my shoulders as the new head of this family. But at the end of the day, you are my little sister. And seeing you sitting here, trying so desperately to look successful when we both know you are drowning, it breaks my heart. Naomi did not blink. She let him continue weaving his web of lies, fascinated by the sheer audacity of his performance. I know Mom and Dad handed you a massive toxic liability. Marcus continued, his voice dropping into a register of fake sincerity. That Alaskan property is a complete nightmare. I had my analysts look into it. The soil is useless. The cabin is an environmental hazard waiting to be fined by the state, and the property taxes are going to bankrupt you within the year. I know you broke the lease on your condo. Jamal told us everything. We know you are out of options. Marcus reached for the manila envelope resting next to his wine glass. He opened it slowly, building the theatrical tension. He pulled out the legal contract and a certified bank check, placing them deliberately on the table and pushing them exactly 1 inch toward Naomi. I cannot sit back and watch my own sister go bankrupt over a piece of frozen dirt, Marcus said, looking her dead in the eyes. So I am going to bite the bullet. I am going to absorb the financial hit for you. I had my legal team draft a purchase agreement. I am buying that property off your hands today for $100,000 cash. He tapped his index finger against the check. His hand was shaking slightly, betraying his internal panic. $100,000, Naomi. Clean money. You can pay off whatever loans you took out to buy that outfit. You can get a nice little apartment somewhere quiet and get back on your feet. Consider it your brother doing charity work to fix our parents' mistake. Chloe immediately chimed in, her voice sharp and demanding. You really need to understand the magnitude of what Marcus is doing for you, Naomi. He is taking money directly out of our personal investment funds to rescue you from your own incompetence. Nobody else on the planet would pay 100 grand for a frozen toxic garbage dump. You should be down on your knees thanking him for this lifeline. It is honestly incredibly generous of us to even speak to you after the way you embarrassed us in the lawyer office. Naomi looked down at the contract and the check. The number 100,000 was printed clearly in bold black ink. 6 months ago, that amount of money might have seemed significant to her. Today, it was less than the monthly interest generated by the Vanguard mineral lease currently sitting in her blind trust account. She looked back up at her brother. The sweat was now visibly beading on his forehead. The facade was cracking. He was staring at the pen resting next to the contract, silently begging her to pick it up. He needed her to sign that paper to save his Miami mansion, to save his ego, to save his entire fraudulent existence. He thought he was throwing a life preserver to a drowning woman, but he was actually handing a loaded gun to his executioner. "This is an interesting offer, Marcus," Naomi said, her voice betraying absolutely no emotion. $100,000 for a piece of land you claim is entirely worthless. That is very out of character for a venture capitalist who prides himself on high-return investments. Why the sudden extreme generosity? Because we are family. Marcus snapped, his patience fraying at the edges. He pushed the contract another inch closer to her. "Do not overthink this, Naomi. You are backed into a corner, and I am offering you the only way out. Take the money, sign the paper. We can all walk away from this clean." Naomi did not reach for the pen. She leaned back in her chair, resting her arms on the armrests, mirroring the exact posture of dominance Marcus had used against her months ago. She let the silence stretch, letting the anxiety suffocate the three people sitting across from her. She was preparing to drop the hammer, but she noticed Jamal shifting nervously in his seat, preparing to launch into his own pathetic segment of this coordinated ambush. She decided to let him speak. She wanted to see exactly how low he was willing to sink before she burned their entire world to ash. Jamal took a deep, shaky breath and pushed his chair back from the table. The sudden screech of the wooden legs scraping against the marble floor drew the attention of several nearby patrons. He slowly walked around the edge of the tufted velvet booth, his eyes fixed on me with an expression of manufactured intense vulnerability. He stopped right beside my chair. Then right in the middle of the crowded, opulent lobby of the Rainier Grand Hotel, Jamal dropped down onto one knee. A soft wave of whispers rippled through the adjacent tables. A few wealthy guests paused their conversations, turning their heads with mild amusement, assuming they were about to witness a romantic afternoon proposal. They had no idea they were actually watching a financially ruined man executing a pathetic, desperate shakedown. Jamal reached out and gently took my left hand in both of his. His palms were incredibly clammy, slick with cold sweat. I did not pull my hand away immediately. I let him hold it simply to observe the sheer physical terror vibrating through his body. "Naomi, please just look at me." Jamal began, his voice cracking with a perfectly rehearsed note of sorrow. He looked up into my eyes, projecting a look of profound heartbreak. "The last 6 months without you have been an absolute living nightmare. I have not been able to sleep. I have not been able to focus on my company. Every single day I wake up and regret walking out of that restaurant." I sat perfectly still, letting him spin his ridiculous web of lies. I noted the frayed edges of his shirt cuffs and the dark, exhausted circles under his eyes. This was not the arrogant tech founder who had slammed his watch on the table and told me I was a terrible investment. This was a cornered rat begging for a lifeline. "I was stupid, Naomi." He continued, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading whisper meant only for me to hear. "I was terrified of the financial pressure. When Marcus cut you out of the will, I panicked. My startup was struggling, and I let the stress completely cloud my judgment. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was actually throwing away the only real thing I ever had. I threw away 5 years of the best relationship of my life because I was a coward." He squeezed my hand, trying to force an emotional connection that had been dead and buried for half a year. But when Marcus called me yesterday and told me he wanted to offer you this buyout, I begged him to let me come along. I told him this was our second chance. Jamal gestured with his free hand toward the contract and the certified check resting on the table. Look at that check, Naomi. $100,000. Do you know what we could do with that kind of capital? We could wipe the slate completely clean. We can pay off whatever debts you have right now. We can get a beautiful new apartment back in the city. I can finally launch my application, and we can actually afford the wedding we always talked about. We can have our entire future back. He leaned his head closer, resting his forehead against the back of my hand, performing the role of the broken, repentant lover to absolute perfection. You do not have to fight your family anymore, he murmured softly. You do not have to struggle in the cold. Marcus is giving us the golden ticket right here. All you have to do is pick up that pen, sign your name, and we can walk out of this hotel together. I will never leave your side again. I swear it to you. Please, Naomi, let me be the man you deserve. Sign the paper and let us go home. I shifted my gaze from the top of Jamal's head to the other side of the table. Marcus was leaning back into the velvet cushions, swirling his expensive Bordeaux with a look of supreme, arrogant satisfaction. He raised his eyebrows at me, giving a slight nod, as if validating Jamal's performance. Chloe was biting her lower lip, pressing her hand against her chest, portraying the image of a deeply moved, supportive sister-in-law. They truly believed this orchestrated emotional manipulation was the final devastating blow that would break my spirit. They thought placing the man I once loved on his knees in a public setting would completely override my logic and force me into submission. My professional training as a geologist requires me to analyze structural weaknesses. I spend my life examining fault lines, looking for the exact point where immense pressure causes a foundation to completely shatter. Looking at the three of them, I saw nothing but a crumbling, unstable trench of lies. Jamal was not looking at me with love. He was gripping my hand because he was terrified I would walk away and leave him to drown in Marcus' bankruptcy. He was using our 5-year history as a weapon to secure his own financial survival. I slowly, deliberately pulled my hand out of Jamal's sweaty grasp. The abrupt withdrawal caused him to stumble slightly, his knee slipping against the polished marble floor. He looked up at me, his rehearsed expression of sorrow instantly replaced by a flash of genuine rising panic. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not look at the $100,000 check. Instead, I reached for the delicate porcelain teacup the waiter had placed in front of me earlier. I lifted it with a remarkably steady hand, brought it to my lips, and took a slow, deliberate sip of the warm chamomile tea. I savored the taste, letting the absolute silence at the table stretch until the tension in the air became thick enough to choke on. I set the porcelain cup back down onto its matching saucer. The soft clinking sound was the only noise at our table. I rested my left hand flat against the glass surface of the table. The heavy platinum bezel of my diamond watch caught the light overhead. I raised my index finger and tapped it once against the glass. The heavy custom-cut emerald ring on my finger struck the table with a sharp, definitive crack. I looked at Jamal kneeling pathetically on the floor. I looked at Chloe with her fake, sympathetic smile. And I looked directly into Marcus' wide, anxious eyes. "Are the three of you done acting?" I asked, my voice echoing with a cold, lethal authority that instantly stripped away every single illusion in the room. I watched the manufactured pity drain out of their faces. They sat frozen, unable to comprehend the sudden absolute shift in the power dynamic. I unclasped my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy portfolio bound in matte black leather. I did not slide it gently across the table. I dropped it directly on top of Marcus' fraudulent purchase contract with a heavy, resounding thud that made Jamal flinch. I opened the portfolio and pulled out 2 pieces of paper. I placed the first document face up right in front of Marcus. It was the certified bank statement from the Obsidian Holdings Trust, displaying the $15 million cash deposit from Vanguard Mining Conglomerate. I placed the second document next to it. It was the executive summary of the Geological Valuation Report, highlighting the $120 million baseline estimate for the raw lithium and rare earth mineral deposits. Marcus leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. His eyes scanned the Vanguard logo, then darted down to the numbers. I watched the exact second his brain processed the sequence of zeros. All the blood instantly violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. His breathing stopped completely. Chloe leaned over his shoulder to look at the paperwork. Her manicured hands began to tremble. The crystal wine glass slipped from her fingers and crashed onto the marble table, shattering into a dozen pieces and sending red wine bleeding across Marcus' worthless $100,000 check. Jamal scrambled backward away from the table, his knees hitting the floor as he desperately tried to distance himself from the explosion he finally realized was happening. "Did you honestly think our parents bought a frozen wasteland for no reason, Marcus?" I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the hotel lobby. They were apex predators in the financial world. They bought that Alaskan property decades ago because they knew it sat directly on top of one of the largest unmapped lithium and rare earth mineral veins in North America. They were just waiting for extraction technology to catch up. And when they died, they left it to me because they knew I was the only person in this family with the scientific intellect required to properly evaluate and leverage it. Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the $15 million cash deposit and then stared blankly at the pathetic $100,000 check he had offered me. "You looked at a $100 million empire and saw a pile of dirt." I continued, leaning forward to look him dead in the eyes. "You were too arrogant and too lazy to do a basic geological survey. You handed me the ultimate winning lottery ticket because you were obsessed with a flashy Miami mansion that you have already managed to lose. Yes, Marcus, I know the bank is foreclosing on Star Island. I know your venture capital fund is completely bankrupt. I know you are drowning in debt and sitting in this lobby spending the absolute last dollar on your credit card trying to scam your own sister out of her inheritance." Chloe let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Jamal was still on the floor, staring at me with a look of absolute, unadulterated horror. He had just thrown away a woman sitting on a $100 million throne to beg for scraps from a bankrupt fraud. "But that is not even the best part, Marcus," I said, sitting back in my chair and adjusting my tailored jacket. "You see, Vanguard Mining Conglomerate was incredibly desperate to secure the domestic mineral rights to my land. They were bleeding investors, and they needed a massive win to stabilize their stock price. They were so desperate that they agreed to every single term I put in my mineral lease agreement, including a 12% gross overriding royalty and a very specific corporate restructuring clause." Marcus finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged whisper. "What did you do?" I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that contained absolutely no mercy. "Vanguard Mining operates under a massive global parent company," I explained, watching his eyes widen with dawning terror. "The exact same parent company that initiated a hostile takeover of your bankrupt venture capital fund at 9 o'clock this morning. They absorbed your toxic assets to liquidate them for tax purposes. And as a non-negotiable condition of my signing the Alaskan mineral lease, I demanded a specific executive action regarding your employment." I leaned forward again, driving the final nail into his coffin. "I had you fired, Marcus. The parent company officially terminated your position as managing director effective immediately. Furthermore, they agreed to flag your financial licenses for gross mismanagement and catastrophic negligence. You are permanently blacklisted from the entire financial sector. No reputable bank, no investment firm, and no venture capital group will ever hire you again. You are completely and utterly finished." Marcus stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The arrogant golden child, the man who had tormented me and belittled my career for my entire life, was completely pulverized. He had nothing left. No money, no house, no career, and no future. I had stripped him of every single thing that gave him power, and I had done it completely within the legal framework of the corporate world he worshipped. Chloe began sobbing loudly, the reality of her destroyed, lavish lifestyle finally crashing down on her. She turned her anger instantly on Marcus, pounding her fists against his expensive suit jacket, screaming at him for losing everything. Jamal remained frozen on the floor, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the wealth he had blindly walked away from. I did not feel an ounce of pity for any of them. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of cruelty, manipulation, and superficial greed. I had simply applied the exact amount of pressure required to shatter their fragile illusions. I turned my attention away from my shattered brother and looked at his sobbing wife. I raised my voice just enough to cut entirely through her hysterical crying. "Chloe," I said sharply. She froze immediately, her mascara running down her pale cheeks in thick dark lines as she looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "That beautiful Miami mansion you love so much was officially foreclosed on by the bank yesterday morning. I had my legal team step in and purchase the property directly from the lender for absolute pennies on the dollar. But do not worry about going back to pack your designer clothes. I am having the entire estate completely demolished next month. I am going to clear the lot and build a state-of-the-art geological research station right on the water. It turns out that exclusive Star Island real estate is absolutely perfect for studying coastal soil erosion." Chloe let out a strangled wail, burying her face in her hands as the reality of her total homelessness fully set in. I did not spare her another glance. I looked down at the floor where Jamal was still kneeling. He was staring up at me with pathetic, desperate tears welling in his eyes. His hands were shaking as he reached out toward me. He opened his mouth to speak, probably to beg for my forgiveness or ask for a second chance. I did not let him utter a single syllable. "You looked me dead in the eye and called me a pathetic loser, Jamal." I said, my words landing like heavy stones in the quiet lobby. But the only pathetic loser in this room is the man forced to kneel on the marble floor and beg at the feet of the exact same woman he thought he could throw away. You wanted to chase wealth and status so badly. Now you get to experience exactly what it feels like to have absolutely nothing. I stood up from the velvet booth and smoothly buttoned my tailored suit jacket. I raised my hand and caught the eye of the hotel concierge. Because I was a verified VIP guest staying in the penthouse suite, the response was instantaneous. 3 large security guards in dark suits immediately marched over to our table. "These 3 individuals are loitering and harassing the hotel guests." I instructed the head of security, my tone completely detached and professional. "Please escort them off the premises immediately. They are no longer welcome here." The security guards did not hesitate. They grabbed Marcus by the arms, hauling his numb, unresponsive body out of the booth. Chloe shrieked and flailed as a guard directed her toward the exit. Jamal scrambled frantically to his feet, stumbling over his own shoes as he was aggressively herded out of the lobby. I did not watch them leave. I picked up my leather portfolio and turned my back on them completely. I walked away from the table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I headed straight toward the private VIP elevators. As the heavy brass doors slid open, I stepped inside and turned around to face the lobby. A cold, deeply satisfying smile spread across my face. I had not just survived their cruelty. I had completely rewritten the rules of the game and claimed my absolute victory. The doors slid shut, leaving the past behind me forever.